You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome, everybody, to this week of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week again by Charles Love of Showtech Solutions. Welcome, Charles.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
Again and again.
Yeah.
So, hey, this week, this is a topic 365. You and I have both lived through sort of someone else's nightmare recently. And nightmare is probably a strong word, but the unknown of dealing with 365 when you have to move it. So it got me thinking about 365. It got me thinking about all of the different things that are out there that are being sold as 365, what the different license types are, how that impacts me as an MSP. And quite honestly, the number of times that you and I probably have both run into an environment where it was self-created, or for lack of a better word, self-inflicted 365 woes, because they spun up the environment themselves, having no prior experience, and just assumed that Microsoft is their new best friend, and look how easy this was, turned it on, and we're off to the races. So, Charles, I'll let you just kind of start us out here, because you've got the most experience between the two of us for sure. What's like the number one thing you see when it comes to a 365 environment, either that's needing to be set up and unrealistic expectations, or it's an environment that's been set up, and again, I go back to probably the unrealistic expectations?
For sure. And 365 is one of those mysterious things that a lot of people have no idea about. I do probably on average 12 to 15 migrations a month myself.
Wow.
And they're not all email migrations. A lot of them are just like moving schools and stuff to the 365 platform.
Sure.
And in so many cases, I would say more than half, people have no idea. Somebody tried setting up 365, gave up, and now their domain is trapped somewhere on some tenant that nobody knows how to get into.
Which
right?
let's talk about that for a minute, like the domain, because I think this is a key piece that a lot of our clients miss, is that, we registered a domain and we followed the directions, we pointed our records, but did they really set it up, and where did they register that domain with, is I think really important.
For sure. There's a couple of things that people get really confused on, right? First, when you set up a tenant, you get what's called an on Microsoft domain.
Sure.
Right. And in all honesty, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what your on Microsoft is. I use a website called, it's goofy, but it's O365 Rocks. And
Okay.
what that does is it lets me, like if I'm setting up a new tenant, I can put in, MSP-Ignite, and it'll tell me if msp-ignite.onmicrosoft.com is taken. This way I can.
That's cool. And then it's not registering the domain.
Correct. So this is specifically for the back end. But the problem you run into with picking an on Microsoft domain is like a law firm, right? A lot of times
yeah,
it's the biggest issue, because today it's, Charles and Chris Law. And then, well, what happens if we hire Josh? And now it's Charles, Chris, and Josh Law. But when I set up the tenant, it's Charles and Chris dot on Microsoft, right? And Josh is like, wait a minute, what about me? There is no way to change your on Microsoft name. Okay. But it doesn't really matter, but it does to some people. The only time you will ever see the on Microsoft name is if you're using a Teams meeting, if you're using a link to OneDrive or a SharePoint link, and you happen to look at the nerd data, right? You happen to look at the URL.
Hey, you
I've had,
spelled my name wrong.
and that's another one. A couple of times a year, I'm doing a tenant migration because the person who set it up typoed the name, right? And they're stuck
Sure.
with it. So every time they invite a customer to a Teams meeting,
Oh
like
man.
like half the time, your name is spelt wrong in the link, right? Like it's embarrassing, and you have to be careful.
Sure.
On the flip side, if you go to somebody like a GoDaddy, where they have Office 365, which is a let's call it a stripped down. It's not quite 365, but it kind of is, but it kind of isn't.
Yeah.
Well, they provision you a name that you don't get to pick. So when you go to GoDaddy, it's like netorg 592783625.onmicrosoft.com, which is fine.
Wait, that's
But
my PIN number.
yeah, but the branding in me is like, oh my God, like, how do they know it's me? It has nothing to do with me. So on Microsoft is very important, to a point, right? You want it small enough and unique enough so that it kind of tells you what tenant it belongs to.
Sure.
So, for example, Showtech Solutions. I would not want to have showtechsolutions.onmicrosoft.com. Maybe I can do showtech.onmicrosoft or Showtech 1 or Showtech 813, something like that.
Right.
But even the 813, what if we move and we go to 727? Now we're stuck with 813. So you have to be very careful how you pick it.
You almost want it to be like a nickname, something that's easy to remember and is associated with you, would not be confusing to somebody. I mean, there's a lot of
Correct.
kind of have to have a lot of thought going into this, really.
So for 5 years, Microsoft has said, we're going to allow you to change it. We're going to allow you to change it. And it just hasn't materialized. However, in the last 6 months, they came out with the ability to rename your primary SharePoint site. And that has a lot to do with it, because once they rename the tenant, like, all heck breaks loose because everything is tied to that unique identifier.
Okay.
So eventually we'll be able to change it, but as of today in 2021, we cannot. So that's one. So first you have the on Microsoft.
Right.
Then you have a domain to validate. Now, and this is where I do a lot of takeovers, meaning I break into somebody's 365 account with a very specific set of instructions, and then I am now an admin of something where the IT person who set it up 5 years ago is long gone, but I'm able to get in. So you can validate your domain without affecting email, right? So that's number two. So getting the domain, you can have your domain parked in as many 365 accounts, it doesn't matter. You just can't have it validated to more than one.
The tenant.
Correct. The actual domain that you're going to use, right?
Oh, sure. So you can verify it, but you can't. Wait, did I say that?
You can add it. You can add it to 5 different tenants.
Got it.
But you can't validate it. You can only have it validated to one at a time.
Which gets into what you're pointing it to with your records, right?
Correct. So in the case of a mail migration, right? So let's say you're going from one tenant to another tenant, you can have it in both tenants, but it's not going to work unless it's validated. So there's a process even to remove the domain. So recently, I had to remove the domain, which is like one of the most scariest things in the whole wide world.
Right, because what's going to happen next, and how long is it going to take?
How long is it going to take? Normally, it's about an hour. But in DNS land, it could take up to 72 hours, right? I had a situation where it got stuck, and 3 hours into it, the domain is still not gone, right? So sometimes you have a dirty system. And in this case, I literally had to go down like 100 users one at a time and start stripping email addresses until we found the person who was causing the issue. And of course, it was like Q.
R.
Yeah. It wasn't A, it wasn't B, it was like way down the list.
Flip the coin. Which direction do you start with?
Correct. It's like the old adage, you have to know where to hit the hammer, right? So you have to know how to do that stuff. So basically, once you once you remove it from one domain, you can add it to
Yeah.
the other and you can validate it. Now, when you validate it, it's just for Office logins. Unless you check the box saying, I want this to be an MX, it ain't
Right.
gonna send mail.
Oh, sure.
But that hangs up so many people.
They get step one done, and then they think it just is all magic.
Yeah, or somebody gets hung up on the on Microsoft and says, well, our company is Smithco. Somebody already has Smithco on Microsoft. Who cares?
Right.
Right? Can you do Smithco 1? Yeah. All right, then do it. Nobody cares, right? So again, on Microsoft name doesn't matter. It's good, but it really doesn't matter.
It's important. It's important in the outcome, but not so much important for the users.
Correct.
Very back end.
And schools are notorious for having 365 tenants that they don't know about.
Oh, for sure, because that's how they get their hands on free 365
Office
seats. Yeah.
As long as you have an email account and somebody has done something in the last 10 years, there's a tenant out there that nobody knows how to get. And the funny thing is you cannot call Microsoft and go, hey, can you break me into this domain? That's not a thing.
Can you let me in, please?
Yeah, because there's no way to validate, right?
Right. So we're back to that original problem. Identity is king.
Yes. So as long as the domain is validated on the account, we can probably break into it, right? I've done some ones where other MSPs have brought me in that says, I just can't figure this out. And then 2 hours later, I'm like, all right, here you go. All validated.
Right.
Merry Christmas. Right. So that's part of it. Right. So now we have our on Microsoft, we have our domain validated. Now we can like do stuff.
Great stuff. Well, so I want to just pause right there before we go sort of into the next phase of this, because I think you've hit on a couple of things that are really important to our listeners. I get that most of the MSPs that are listening to this are going to go, I know how to do all that. And this isn't for 1 second saying that we're taking this show and we're trying to, make this a level 101 course on 365.
Yep.
The premise of this is to talk about a couple key components that you step through. One is the identity of the client, and more to the identity of what happens on the back end than what we're going to necessarily see on the surface, and creating some expectations, because this identity is key to avoiding as much as possible phishing, identity theft, like stealing the domain. We haven't even really touched on it yet, but as we kind of continue to progress, I want to make sure we don't forget about where you've registered the domain, and then the DNS records or your zone files that a lot of people think that is the same thing. So just to be clear, I'll set the stage for this. I can register with GoDaddy or register my site. I can register it through Microsoft. There's a lot of places that I can do that. That is just where the domain has been registered. That is not the zone files, right? So I might choose to point DNS to 365. I might choose to point it to whoever I'm hosting with, and then go build my zone file there. Can you touch on that a little bit, Charles? Because I think this is almost as bad or worse than I can't find my 365 tenant. It's like, wait, we have that domain name?
Yeah. Oh man, like, do you know how many times I have conversations with people? Since we moved to you, I can get rid of GoDaddy, right? No, you can't. You will continue to pay them until the end of time.
There's GoDaddy and there's GoDaddy, right?
Yeah, for sure. But that's a people don't realize that, oh yeah, I do have to pay to keep that domain name every year.
Right.
That's why I tell them, buy more than one. This way we don't have to have this conversation every year like clockwork. Just buy 10 years. You're not changing your domain name, right? So that's one of the biggest misunderstanding is how my registrar, network solutions, whatever it may be.
Yeah. That's
GoDaddy.
What I was looking for. Registrar.
Yeah. So where that comes into play, and let me tell you, that's a whole other sidebar about people not securing their registration. Like that's, if you're listening to this and you log into your GoDaddy account or your customer's GoDaddy account or network solutions and it is not asking for two-factor, shame. There's a new thing happening, just a sidebar. People are breaking into GoDaddy accounts and wiping the DNS records. So that's fun. So that's
like how fun.
Yeah, like why
super.
is the mail flowing? Yeah. So the DNS, that's one thing that happens. Another thing that happens is the web guy or gal gets involved and decides one day, I'm going to move you over to WordPress.
Mm-hmm.
And they redirect the MX records over to WordPress without knowing, because they just clicking buttons.
Or
right?
they just pointed DNS, right? Like, so you've got zone files somewhere else. They're like, oh, this is really easy because WordPress says that they can host DNS and we'll just switch it.
Yeah, I mean, if you do 365 right, you have the 3 core records for mail, you have the 2 CNAMEs, and then you have the other 3 if you're using the Skype. So let's just say there's like, 8 or so. All people think about is MX records. They don't think about the DKIM. They don't think about the SPF. They don't think about any of that stuff.
DMARC,
yeah. So I use a third-party DNS monitoring thing so that if the MX record or any DNS record ever gets modified, I get an email that goes, hey, the MX record has disappeared from this domain. And that's when I make a call. Hey, customer X, is your web folks doing anything? Funny you say that. We haven't gotten email in the last hour. Yes, that's why I'm calling. So that's how we're like combating it. But the registrar is super important. And in some cases, I have moved NS1 and NS2, which is the primary record, off of GoDaddy. And I do it to one of 2 places. Microsoft now can handle your NS, your full domain,
full zone file,
which is awesome because now you're taking away fiddling with DNS records from the web team.
Sure.
And you're putting it back in admin's control.
Because web team probably set it up with GoDaddy.
Well, yeah, and they're just clicking buttons, right? Hey, do you want to upgrade to secure DNS? Sure, I don't know what that is, but I'm going to click it.
It's only $5.
Yeah. So I'll send customers now to Microsoft for NS1 and NS2 so that I can control their DNS a lot better. Or my favorite thing in the whole wide world, which is Cloudflare. Right?
That is what I use, yeah.
We'll redirect it'll still stay in GoDaddy land.
Yep.
But we'll send it to Cloudflare again so admin can keep control of the records.
Yeah.
I only really do that for managed customers. We have a few hundred customers where we just do like licensing with, and like I'm in no interest to handle Cloudflare for those guys, right? Because they're just here for licensing. But if it's a managed customer, I need to kind of keep control. And recently, about a year ago, Microsoft will actually allow you to buy domains from them.
Right, I did see that. So that does help. This goes back to I haven't ever had to try to leave Microsoft, but I know like some of your other registrars, 1&1 and a few of the others, man, they made it so painful to try and move your domain. It's almost
to save
like
$12, right? Yeah, to save $12. I mean,
like, and you're like, hey, where do I just check the box for $100? This isn't a problem anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that's a big thing, right? So going back to the 365, like we're only at the level of I just need to get the stuff to 365.
Right.
Right. And that's a lot of work to get to that point. Then there's the whole, okay, we have it. Now what?
So we've almost spent half an episode kind of talking about getting there or getting there correctly. If you're already there, there might be pieces that still need to be cleaned up. You talked about records. I think those are things that are really important. I know a lot of people, even if you're really good at what you do, the records are often overlooked, especially when it comes to DMARC and DKIM. Having that conversation with the client to talk about why are you getting so many spam emails and phishing emails? It's like, well, let's take a deeper look at your DMARC and DKIM, even SPF for that matter. But the DMARC and DKIM, that's that validation that says I am who I say I am, right?
Yep.
There's actually something coming down the pipe. I'm going to draw a blank on the name that it's being called, but it actually uses an image, a logo signature that gets embedded in the email header, and the service now being adopted by Google and Microsoft, and I think there's others that are coming right behind them that basically are saying this third party open source solution is going to be that added layer of this is a spoofed email and we're not letting it through because they don't have the logo signature in the header.
Yep.
So this is like pretty serious stuff. We've not really used a lot of language around security, but fundamentally this is the foundation that allows some level of, I can say confidently that we have secured the components of at least the flow of your data, right?
For sure.
If nothing more, at least the data is flowing correctly into the right place and it's not getting redirected someplace it shouldn't.
Yeah. So now comes
Now we're
fun.
here.
Now we have the tenant.
So let's
right?
talk about the tenant from the perspective of, first, you're coming into a 365 tenant that has already been stood up. And I shared this with you before. There is a belief out there that says because it is Microsoft, and you could fill in the blank with really any vendor, because it's vendor X, they've done a great job of building out this product to be very secure because they are fill in the blank vendor, right? And insert what really happens, Charles.
Yeah, it's kind of like, hey, look at my door. I put one of these multi-lock things. The only way you can make a copy of my key is if you have my card, right? But I can smash your window, right? Like it really doesn't matter. You leave your garage door open.
Yeah.
What does it matter? You have a thing.
Your garage door has a short. It keeps going up and down. I just got to wait for the right time. And just...
Yeah. So Microsoft gives you all the foundations for you to make it right or destroy it, however you see fit, right? Old tenants are the worst. Like schools that didn't know they had one and it was set up 4 or 5 years ago. There are certain things. The one thing I always tell customers is 365 is not like old school Office, where old school Office, if you had 2013, you will have 2013 until the end of time.
Sure.
Right? Nothing changes. Maybe a little bit, maybe a tweak here and there with an update, but nothing changes. Microsoft says, hey, you know what? Today we're changing all the icons. Right. Poof, you get new icons. Doesn't matter if you want it or not, you're getting the new icons, right? So now we're in this ever evolving state of change, which is good, right? Because that's what you're paying for. But the problem here is some of the settings on super old tenants, they don't get flipped on by default.
Or do they get flipped off?
Correct. So a good example is two-factor, right? I'm always preaching to everybody, turn on two-factor in Microsoft. I don't care.
Yeah.
Just use the man, during COVID, whatever they did in Microsoft land, during COVID, the Microsoft two-factor product changed drastically in the last 12 months.
Well, they added third party.
Well, not only that, it's just the way the authenticator works. It's just magical. So, what somebody will do is they'll go in and they'll just go, you know what, wild hair, we're going to turn on two-factor for everybody. Yeah. Turn it on, and next thing you know, they're getting calls left and right saying, I can't log in. What's going on? I've did an app password, that kind of works, but not really. And then when you look at the tenant, you're like, well, you missed one very important step, which is there's a checkbox for modern authentication, which in Microsoft land is the pop-up that does the two-factor. But that's a good example. Older tenants, they did not force that on for everybody. If you're a new tenant set up in the last 6 to 12 months, it's on.
Yeah.
Right. So, like I've done it before where we turn on two-factor.
Don't forget the part where it's when you do turn it on, how are you giving them the opportunity to set it up? Because in a lot of cases, turning it on without giving a window of time to be set up just prevents you from logging in at all anyway.
I have a unique way that seems to work for us, but
the recovery one, I forget that one a lot. Make sure that your users have gone in and set up like a mobile number or some sort of like recovery to get back in there. Otherwise, it'll say, please contact your administrator. Yeah. This has not been set up for you.
Yeah, if you've turned on password self-service.
Right.
But like that's another one. That's off by default. Not everybody wants that on. So there's a lot to go on, and we can go on for 3 hours.
So let's talk about the defaults that are now available when you set up a tenant, that if it's an older tenant are often not even considered because they're not getting turned on because Microsoft has added it. The first one that comes to mind is, I think it's default security is a checkbox. When you set up a tenant, it prompts to choose that. If you don't, obviously it'll never prompt you again. Are you seeing that a lot, especially with older tenants?
Yes. So security default is a good one. That's off by default on with new tenants. In some cases, I think it depends on how the account was created. That's where you can go in and say, everybody gets two-factor. You're allowed to do, these various things.
Sure.
But it's a conversation, right? Some customers, we deal with a lot of nonprofits, and in the beginning, they're very hesitant about having their employees who have personal cell phones get a text message on their phone. So once you get through that barrier, and you say, but they do it for Facebook, right? They do it for every other thing in the world. So
I just had that conversation with a school district, and it was like I had the chin to the floor. Like, what are you telling me that I can now have my phone in the classroom? I'm like, let's be clear about two things. One, it doesn't require the internet for the rotating key that's on the app on your phone.
Correct.
And number two, once you've logged in, if you're having to log into your mail more than once a day, we've got a different problem on our hands. And I would raise the question, who's repeatedly trying to get into your account?
For sure. So going back to the defaults, there's a lot of things. Yeah. So security defaults is one, modern authentication is another. Those are the two big ones.
Right. And talk about that for a second. Modern authentication, we're essentially saying no more TLS 1.0, 1.1, correct? And no more legacy connectors.
And it's the ability to allow you to use things like two-factor.
Sure.
Right. That's the big one. But the other thing we'll do is when we get into a tenant is I have some assessment tools we'll run.
Sure.
But in all honesty, the built-in Microsoft ones and like the Compliance Center, really gives you a baseline. Hey, here's all the thing Microsoft wants you to have, right? Grain of salt.
There's like 712 controls in there. And usually you come out with a default setup, you've got 600 and some controls that need to be addressed.
Correct. And if Microsoft had their way, everybody would be buying the, E300 license, right? Which is, whatever.
It's new.
The top tier where you get everything in the world.
The 300 tier.
Yeah. It's $1,000 a user month kind of thing. But running those assessments, compliance manager, just to kind of get a baseline, right? And a lot of it can go and look at how you're currently using data. Like, everyone says they don't violate PCI, but everybody does, right? Not everybody. That's too, a lot of people do unknowingly. Let's put it that way. But just being able to take that baseline, go back to the customer and be like, all right, here's what we're seeing. Do you realize people are sending socials? No, but somebody is, and here's the proof.
Right. And that's in like one of the 3 or 4 things that even if you have business premium or a lower end account, you can adjust your spam filter policy. You can turn on the basic DLP that says just follow the PII. I think it's PII is what they have in there for your lower end tier. I would say probably for 2 out of 3 tenants that I've looked at, that's not even turned on, or it's turned on, but it has no keywords in it at all.
Correct. And a lot of times we don't know the customer's keys, but it's a conversation to have. We're sitting with whoever's the compliance officer, right? It's probably the front desk, admin, because that's the only person we talk to in most cases. But it's just really walking through and saying, hey, here's where we are. And then I use another product called LionGuard, which also has a set of baselines. And every time I put up a new tenant, I get 40 tickets saying all these things are terrible, right? And then I can go back to the customer and we're like, hey, do you realize you don't have a password policy? Yes, we do. Where is it? It's on a piece of paper. It says everyone must change their password every 90 days. Oh, okay, nobody is doing it, right? So it's being
And
able
that's a
to
big one.
validate.
That's a really big one, right? I think about that a lot. So I don't know how many times I've had someone tell me, we have a policy for that. I'm like, please walk me through that. In fact, you and I have a policy at home, right? Hey, my credit card was compromised. What do you do? Like, well, I called my bank, had them cancel my card, send me a new card. It's a pretty good policy. Is it written down somewhere? No. Does anybody else know your policy? No, but your wife can probably
Yeah,
guess it, right? Your wife would probably do the same thing, but it's still not her policy. It's your policy, and she's just guessing.
for sure. For sure. So it's, it's stuff like that. It's just, it's really combing through. If you're just chucking on two-factor, tenant saying Merry Christmas, have a nice day,
Sure.
you're missing a lot.
All right, so we've got a few minutes before we close this out. So let's talk a little bit about licensing, and from the perspective of compliance. You and I recently went through this. There are, we'll just say that there's the business premium stuff, which I think is the replacement to, I don't even remember what it's called before, professional. I
Yeah,
think it's called professional. Now it's business premium. You've got your more enterprise seats, you've got your education seats, and you got government seats. You're in some model of that. And let's just touch on real quick, what can you do based on the tiers and who can sell them? Because I think that's really important right now as we're seeing certain vendors charge exponential dollars for what everybody around them can sell, and there's really nothing being done. There's no magic behind the curtain to actually get that tenant stood up.
Yeah. So I'll give everybody a little knowledge nugget, as it were. There's a website, M as in Microsoft 365 Maps, maps.com. Really cool website where it shows you all of the product categories in kind of like an eye chart. This way, because oh my God, there's so many and they keep changing, right? Do I want to sell Office 365 or do I want to sell Microsoft 365, right? That's the big one. It's very different. And this website kind of gives you the cheat sheet. But for the most part, there's only a handful of categories, right? You got your commercial stuff, which could be anything from E3 to business to whatever. Then you have the nonprofit stuff, which needs special validation.
Right.
And I have a very tried and true method of getting a customer validated if they check all the boxes. You have education, which is its own set of validation, right?
And then you that one.
Yeah. Then you have government. So there's two levels of government. Your GCCs, where it is technically a special 365 setup, and then you have your GCC high, which is its own total nightmare. For the most part, the only thing that like we can't do is the high, because it has to go to one of those
secure.
Yeah, there's like 7 people in the
and I
US.
can touch on the GCC high real quick. That literally just gets into, if you're dealing with ITARs and you're dealing with foreign anything, or you're dealing directly with a DoD contract where CUI data is going to traverse between DoD directly and private sector, you probably are going to have to do GCC high in order to share data, because essentially GCC high, they're validating both parties before they allow the communication to happen. So like regular GCC, I can't just send stuff or share stuff with a DoD contractor. It's going to say, sorry, you can't do that. The other thing that I wanted to share, and you can talk more about the different tiers here, but a lot of things that people might need for compliance. Let's say they have to do CMMC level 3, and so they're going GCC. They are no longer going to have the advantage of being able to use all those third-party plugins in Microsoft land because they're not GCC compliant. So we've run into this before, like got to be GCC. So we move them over. They're like, XYZ integration with QuickBooks doesn't work. Like it's not going to. We talked about this before the migration. You no longer have those, cool little widgets. So talk to me, I think as we close out, the two things that I think are really important is what does, like advanced threat protection, maybe some of the DLP stuff that is available really across any of your license stacks. but are not just on because you're using 365.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, old tenant versus new tenant. New tenant, a lot of the baselines are Microsoft has done a fairly decent job
It's
about.
on.
It's on a brand new tenant. It's pretty much where it should be.
Sure.
On an old tenant, man, just throw a dice. Like, you never know. So I kind of wish there was like a reset button.
Do you ever make that recommendation? Because you could just say we're going to stand up a new tenant.
So sometimes, if I'm converting a tenant, I'm going to spend a little bit of time and to comb through the ATP stuff. They've renamed it Defender,
Sure.
whatever. But just making sure that we are sending things to junk folder.
Right.
If it is failing SPF, we are sending it to junk folder. Stuff like that. Just tweaks here and there, making sure. A big thing is, are we allowed to share links outside the company?
Right.
Like, what's the policy on that? A lot of times customers like, hey, I'm trying to share this SharePoint folder to my buddy. Not my buddy, but a customer.
Sure, but it gets into the external versus internal of SharePoint and OneDrive.
And it's off by default.
Right.
Right. But a customer's like, well, but I need this folder shared. Okay. Here's a form I need you to fill out.
It actually moves it, if I'm not mistaken, when you go public SharePoint sharing, that is a different repository than internal SharePoint.
Depends how you do it.
Got it.
Right. If you're triggering it through the OneDrive mechanism, then yes. If you're triggering it through like Teams, it's a live file.
It's a live file, right. But you also, it's a little bit different. I think we use them differently anyway, so that does help. So as we close this out, I hear three things. One, policies. Policies. So policies are going to drive. So turning on like default security is going to drive making sure that two-factor authentication gets turned on. Making sure the endpoints are patched and up to date is going to be another one, because if it is an older tenant and 1.0 and 1.1 TLS happen to be, for whatever reason, ever enabled, if that endpoint that's connecting on that protocol, you can't remove it in Microsoft or 365 land until you go and hit that endpoint and upgrade the appropriate environment. So that's one thing we didn't really spend a lot of time on, maybe another episode. What does it look like to secure the endpoint or clean up the endpoints so that they're not making the data dirty in 365?
It's easy. Just take away their keyboard.
Right. Here we go.
That's how you secure it. Yeah, you don't get a keyboard.
We're going to secure everything. We are going to turn the servers off.
Yes.
And then the third one is just remember that as you look at compliance and some of these other things, you need to be aware of the things that may go away that are not thought through before toggles start getting turned on, and now you have a really upset customer. Does that pretty much sum it up? Like,
yeah, for the most part, yeah.
Licensing is important. Every partner can sell 99% of the licensing, so don't let someone tell you that, oh, I have to go with this vendor unless it's GCC high.
For sure.
So, Charles, I really appreciate it. This has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.
Thanks, guys.